Bloodline-Only IO is dead. How did it happen? Well, it was surprisingly easy. In recent discussions with Jason DaCosta and other Bloodline-Only IO proponents, I stopped chasing the seemingly endless supply of theological arguments and inferences they could generate. Instead, I started doing something much simpler. I asked them to establish the disputed premises their entire model depends upon. And the result? Avoidance, redirection, and more appeals to inference. In particular, I asked two very simple foundational questions. 1. What biblical text states that biological descent from Jacob was an absolute prerequisite for participation in Israel's new covenant? And 2. What text identifies Cornelius as biologically descended from Jacob? These aren't peripheral questions. They go straight to the foundation of Bloodline-Only IO. Think about the argument. Bloodline-only proponents tell us that the Spirit was promised to Israel. I agree. Cornelius received that promised Spirit. Yes. Acts explicitly tells us that. But then comes the crucial conclusion. Therefore, Cornelius must have been a biological descendant of Jacob. That conclusion only follows if another, unproven premise is true. Only biological descendants of Jacob were eligible to participate in Israel's new covenant promises and receive the promised Spirit. And that is precisely the disputed premise. So, Bloodline-Only IO proponents need to prove it, not just assume it, and then assert it. And when I say prove, I'm not demanding mathematical certainty. I'm talking about establishing the proposition with sufficient textual, historical, or scholarly evidence, rather than merely assuming the proposition and reasoning from it. They need to show the text establishing biological descent from Jacob as the absolute eligibility requirement, and then, independently, show the text identifying Cornelius as possessing that ancestry. Because if participation in Israel's new covenant promises did not absolutely require Jacobite biology, then the inference from Israel's promise to biological Israelite recipient is no longer necessary. And if Acts never identifies Cornelius as biologically descended from Jacob, then saying he must have been one because he received Israel's promised Spirit is exactly that. An inference about his genealogy, not evidence of his genealogy. In all of my discussions with them, no direct textual evidence was produced, establishing either disputed premise. Instead, the discussion repeatedly returned to the same kinds of arguments, assumptions, and inferences asserted as facts, but never proven. For example, they will often say, the Spirit was promised to Israel, therefore Cornelius must have been biologically Israelite. Or, the new covenant was made with Israel, therefore every participant must have been biologically Israelite. Or, the promises belonged to Abraham and his descendants, therefore genuine foreigners could never participate in those promises through covenantal incorporation. But notice what keeps happening. The biological restriction is assumed first, and then that assumption is used to generate the conclusion. That's the vulnerability. That's the open wound in a very weakened bloodline-only argument, and saying that these conclusions can be inferred doesn't solve the problem. Of course, biblical interpretation involves inference. My argument isn't that inference is illegitimate. The question is whether this particular disputed inference has been independently established before being treated as a fact. So, I've changed the rules of engagement with Bloodline-Only IO. I won't be chasing downstream theological arguments based on assumptions and inferences. From now on, if a bloodline-only proponent wants to argue from biological exclusivity, they need to prove biological exclusivity first. If they claim biological descent from Jacob was an absolute prerequisite for participation in Israel's new covenant, they will have to first establish that proposition with textual and historical evidence. If they claim Cornelius was biologically descended from Jacob, establish his genealogy from the evidence. Premises first, conclusions second. That's how one can keep the discussion centered on evidence instead of disappearing into an endless maze of competing theological inferences. I've found that when this rule of engagement is consistently enforced, their attempts to argue for Bloodline-Only IO essentially ceases. So far, they have not produced the direct textual evidence establishing that biological restriction. They have no explicit text establishing biological descent from Jacob as the absolute New Covenant eligibility requirement. They have no historical evidence demonstrating that covenantally incorporated foreigners were universally excluded from Israel's covenant privileges because of their ancestry. And I have yet to see them produce mainstream scholarship establishing the absolute biological exclusivity their model requires. As such, Bloodline-Only IO survives primarily as an inferential construct, not as a restriction explicitly established by the evidence. And that is precisely why Jason DaCosta's forthcoming book interests me. Apparently, in response to my book and the videos I've produced defending covenantal inclusion in ancient Israel, Jason decided to write a new book defending the Bloodline-Only IO position on the promises to Abraham and his descendants. He has described it as the most exegetical book he's ever read, and says he wrote it in about 2 weeks because the subject is supposedly so simple and because Bloodline-Only IO just works. Well, I'm interested because if Jason has finally produced textual, historical, and scholarly evidence demonstrating that Israel's covenant community was restricted exclusively to biological descendants of Jacob, and that genuine incorporated foreigners remain disqualified from Israel's covenant privileges and promises because of their ancestry, then I genuinely want to see that evidence. Because evidence is exactly what Bloodline-Only IO needs. Whether somebody wrote a book in 2 weeks or 4 years doesn't determine whether it's correct. The evidence does. But there is a reason concealed in covenant, the case for Israel, only took me nearly 4 years to develop. I researched the historical context. I examined the relevant biblical texts and historical sources. I engaged the relevant scholarship. And importantly, I was willing to reconsider assumptions that I myself had previously held to and follow the evidence where it best pointed. The IO book continued to change as the evidence changed my understanding. And that process eventually produced what is a considerably more robust and defensible version of Israel only, the covenantal inclusion model of IO. Unlike the premise of biological restriction, I've been challenging bloodline-only proponents to prove covenantal inclusion isn't something we have to manufacture out of thin air. We can actually point to the texts. We can see the historical examples. And we can see that the reality of incorporation and conversion is well recognized in historical scholarship. Exodus 12:40, 8-49, describes a foreigner being circumcised, keeping Yahweh's Passover, and being treated as a native of the land. Numbers 15:15-16 establishes one statute and one law for Israel, and the foreigner dwelling among them. Deuteronomy 29 explicitly places the foreigner standing among Israel into Yahweh's covenant. Isaiah 56 describes foreigners joining themselves to Yahweh and being accepted in his house. And Ezekiel 47-22-23 goes even further. Foreigners living among Israel are to be treated as native born among the children of Israel and receive an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. None of those foreigners needed their DNA magically changed. None of them needed to become genealogical descendants of Jacob. And that's exactly where covenantal inclusion becomes fatal to the Bloodline-Only IO model. Bloodline-Only IO doesn't merely need to show that biological Israelites participated in Israel's covenant. Of course they did. It needs to establish the much stronger proposition that only biological Israelites could participate. But if even one genuine foreigner could be covenantally incorporated into Israel without becoming a biological Jacobite, then biological descent cannot have been an absolute prerequisite for covenant membership. That's the distinction Bloodline-Only IO repeatedly blurs. Genealogy and covenant membership were not coextensive categories. Notably, the Covenantal Inclusion model of IO has never argued that covenantal inclusion transformed a foreigner's biological ancestry. Obviously, it didn't. The Covenantal Inclusion model of IO argues that Scripture itself provides mechanisms through which genuine foreigners could be legally and covenantally incorporated into Israel's community without becoming biological descendants of Jacob. And that's not merely a theological possibility. The phenomenon of incorporation, conversion, and the complex relationship between ancestry and Jewish or Israelite identity is well recognized in historical scholarship. That's why the Covenantal Inclusion model has room to grow. It doesn't require us to turn every inconvenient Gentile into a secret biological Israelite. It doesn't require us to discover an Israelite genealogy that Luke never gives Cornelius. And it doesn't require us to assume that because a promise belonged corporately to Israel, every individual participating in that promise therefore had to possess Jacob's biology. Instead, it recognizes something Scripture itself repeatedly demonstrates. Israel could remain Israel while genuine foreigners were incorporated into Israel's covenant community. And that brings us back to where I started. Why do I say Bloodline-Only IO is dead? It's dead because its defining biological restriction has a fatal evidentiary vulnerability. Bloodline-Only IO needs biological descent from Jacob to function as an absolute boundary around Israel's covenant promises. It needs figures, such as Cornelius, to have been secret biological Israelites whenever those figures participate in Israel's promised blessings. But when you stop chasing all the conclusions produced by those assumptions and simply ask, where is the biological restriction actually established? And where is Cornelius actually identified as biologically descended from Jacob? Suddenly, the entire discussion changes. The burden is no longer on Covenantal Inclusion IO to disprove an endless series of theological possibilities. The burden is on Bloodline-Only IO to establish the premises that make its distinctive claims necessary in the first place. And sooner or later, somebody was going to recognize that vulnerability. Somebody was going to stop chasing the endless theological rabbit trails, isolate the foundational premises, and demand that they actually be demonstrated. As it turns out, that person was the guy who spent nearly 4 years researching and writing the IO book, and who was willing to revise his own position when the evidence demanded it. Yours truly, Bloodline-Only IO is dead. Now, if somebody wants to resurrect it, they know exactly what they need to prove.